Michigan State and Iowa for all the Big Ten marbles. Saturday night in Indy, number 4 versus number 5. 46th all-time meeting, the first time ever that both have been ranked in the top 10. Third ever title game for the Spartans, the Hawks making their first appearance, and everyone involved knows it is essentially a play-in game for the college football playoff.
Everyone likes to talk about the playoffs, but for us it's always been, you just have to keep winning.
I don't see how they can keep the Big Ten out of the playoffs for the winner of this game. So we know what's on the line.
We know that this game is the game that's going to get us there.
Playing for something that we've been working for ever since the summer. This playoff, it means a lot to us.
We know what's at stake. I think we've been doing a good job all season at knocking out the noise.
Pressure is good, stress is bad. We have good pressure on us for this game.
We know it's a big game, and we know, if we win the game, we probably have a shot at being in that Final Four. But we're more focused on winning this one because we know this is going to be a tough game.
It is indeed. Guys, I'm always interested in the psychology of the game. And Michigan State, they love being the underdogs. They are clearly not in this game. They have played in a lot of big games. They've won 6 of their last 7 against top 10 teams. Iowa hasn't been in this situation before. I mean, you could kind of go on these psychological components. What interests you there?
Well, for me, it comes down to one word, and that word is trust. And I really trust Mark D'Antonio when it comes to preparing his football team mentally to be able to go into battle. Like you said, 2 years ago, nobody expected them to make that run with a sophomore quarterback to the Rose Bowl like they did. So you trust him in preparing them for that situation. You bring it back to this season. They had lost to Oregon last year, lost to Ohio State last year. This year, he had to mentally prepare them to fight. And no matter how we won the game, this is how we have to do it to make it to the college football playoff. And you see every one of his players talked about this is what we have to do to go to the playoff. We want to get to the mountaintop. So he's been pushing that on them all offseason.
Yeah, Brandon, you mentioned trust. I would also say expectations. And I think that's probably where you see the difference is that Michigan State comes into this season, and I think they expected to be in this situation, competing for a Big Ten title and potentially to get into the college football playoff. And I would imagine there were plenty of Iowa players and maybe some of the coaches in the back of their minds saying, yeah, we want to win the West and we want to get into the Big Ten championship. But I don't know if coming into the 2015 season, they said, we're going to be undefeated, we're going to go to the college football playoff. So it's two teams, in my opinion, that have probably a little bit different expectations coming into it. But you also mentioned underdog, guys, and I think that's a very good point because Michigan State has been the underdog, and I don't think everybody looks at them as the underdog anymore, whereas that's where Iowa is right now. I think everybody nationally is like, at what point is this going to run out for Iowa? What point are they going to end up losing a game? And even C.J. Beathard just said, we've done a great job of knocking out the noise. Well, can they continue to knock out the noise when everybody coming into this matchup thinks that Michigan State is the better team?
I will tell you this. When we were at Big Ten Media Days and we had Iowa players on the set with me and I asked kind of what's a goal, what would be a successful season, I believe was my question. And the Iowa players all said, we're going to win every game. And you kind of have that moment where you look at them and say, really? And they look back very earnestly and said, yes. So that was interesting. I mean, I understand what you're saying. Look, the Michigan State has a bunch of guys, Shalik Calhoun, Connor Cook. They came back expressly because they feel like they didn't finish up what they started. Yeah. They wanted to play in the college football playoff. But I would say, based on the conversations I had with the Iowa guys, they thought they were going to be here. Now, this is the first time these two teams have played since 2013. That was Connor Cook's first ever start in a Big Ten game as Michigan State's quarterback. But Iowa certainly has some familiarity with Michigan State's scheme. Remember, they played Pitt earlier this year. Pat Narduzzi was the defensive coordinator for Michigan State up until last season. Here's what Kirk Ferentz had to say about that matchup.
We haven't played Michigan State in a while now, as you know, so a little distance in there, but we got a practice game, if you will. It's almost like in high school, you got those two scrimmages before you start playing. So at least it's not totally out of our minds. Yeah, I think they're very, very similar, at least from the defensive standpoint. And, hopefully it'll be of some help, but then that also helps them to get some exposure to what we might be thinking.
Remember, that's a game that Iowa won on a last-second 57-yard field goal. What did you learn from that game that might be instructive for this one?
What was interesting, they won on the last-second field goal, but if you remember, Pittsburgh's head coach called a timeout before the first field goal, and he missed that one, and then he made that one. But so Pittsburgh, to me, they were the more physical football team. They came in and they were ready for whatever Iowa was bringing to them. And it seemed like C.J. Beathard, the only answer he had was to run the football. He made a big third down run a few times, and he also had a run on 3rd and 5 where he scored a touchdown. It looked like they were out of sync on offense, and Pittsburgh was just a more physical football team, and they had a great scheme. So if D'Antonio talks to Pat Narduzzi and asks him, what did you do? Why did you do that? I think it could spell trouble for
Yeah,
Iowa.
I think it's going to be a great learning experience because if you go back to that Pitt game, Pitt and Pat Narduzzi brought that same favorite pressure that he brought when he was at Michigan State, which is those linebackers crossing in the A-gaps, and they actually ended up getting to C.J. Beathard back in the first quarter, got the sack, ended up knocking the ball loose. The play was reviewed, given back to Iowa because his elbow was down. But then you fast forward, you look at Michigan State last week against Penn State, exact same thing. It's no surprise. Kirk Ferentz and everybody on the offensive side of the ball, you know what you're going to get from that defense, but you don't know when you're going to get it. And then once it does come, you've got to be able to execute on the offensive line and whether or not you're going to get your running back into protection as well. Because if you don't have that thing figured out with those guys coming right up the gut, it doesn't take long for them to get to the quarterback. And if you don't either make a quick decision or somebody picks it up, now you're looking at second, third long, maybe even stopping a drive.
Only 105 rushing yards in that game for Iowa. That was a season low for them. And again, I think it gets a little dangerous to say this is what Pittsburgh did, ergo that this is what Michigan State's going to do. But there are, look, Narduzzi was with D'Antonio forever. I mean, going back to Cincinnati. And so their philosophies obviously evolved with one another. What about on the flip side? What about D'Antonio? If you're Mark D'Antonio, what concerns you about this game?
Yeah, I think from a defensive standpoint, even though Michigan State has been one of the best defenses over the last 5 or 6 years, I still think that they're a little nervous about this Iowa run game because there's been so many opportunities where Jordan Canzeri and the rest of those running backs, LaShawn Daniels, even Akram Wadley, have gotten into open space, and all of a sudden you look up and they're making some type of explosive play. You got Iowa averaging 204 yards per game on the ground, and Michigan State generally a good running team as well, but nowhere near like Iowa this year. Now, they go back to that Ohio State game, and Ezekiel Elliott's been one of the best running backs in the country, and they had an outstanding formula to be able to slow down that Buckeyes offense. That's going to have to carry over again because I think that if you end up bottling up this Iowa running game and make C.J. Beathard go through the top, I like that matchup because even though there's been some criticism for the Michigan State defensive backs, I think they've gotten a lot of confidence over the last couple of weeks. Now you get them predictable. Iowa offensively, these defensive backs start looking for interceptions.
Yeah, and this is hands down the best defensive line that Iowa will have faced all season. Like you talked about how they slowed down Elliott. They also slowed down Royce Freeman from Oregon. They held him to 92. They slowed down Michigan's run game with Devin Smith, held him to 46. So this is the pedigree that they've been building all season, and they're gaining that momentum so they can be prepared for Iowa.
And great in big games. I mean,
Yeah.
you alluded to the Michigan game, the Ohio State game. They held both of those teams to season lows in total yards. So when they have needed to step up, they certainly have.